Great. Welcome back, everybody. And I'd love to hear from some of y'all. Trevor S., what did y'all talk about for what is an API?
Yeah, we talked a lot about it being essentially a binding between servers. Being able to communicate from one server to the other. Things like using a weather API to have data as far as temperature, weather within one's website or other server.
Yeah, absolutely. A way for your servers to connect and share information for like the applications to talk to each other, right? Cool, thank you. Let me call on someone else. Jacob A., why do we use APIs or what's a possible way we would want to use an API?
Yeah, I think my group had a better grasp than I did, but my broad understanding is it makes it easier for two software programs to sort of like interact with each other, and that you don't have to build up. There's already something sort of built there to make the interaction easier.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks. Does anybody have anything to add to that? You can raise your hand. I think that's a good high-level way of describing it for now. Okay, I'll call on someone else for abstraction. Kyle, what did y'all talk about? What is abstraction?
We talked about the idea of hiding like low-level pieces of code in sort of like higher-level things, and like essentially making it so that all the really technical behind-the-scenes stuff doesn't need to be shown to the user.
Yep, exactly. I described it in a very similar way. We talked the other day about our examples of we can drive a car. We don't need to know how the internal combustion works. We have a high-level interface to work off of, and the low-level implementation is hidden from us. Yeah, exactly. One more person. Brisa, what is encapsulation? What did your group talk about?
Encapsulation is kind of where you just go ahead and keep methods inside of a class. So you're kind of just restricting certain data to be accessed, hopefully.
Yeah, no, that was good. Thank you. And I would expand on that by saying, yeah, encapsulation is making sure that data is all organized in data, and the things that are manipulating that data are organized as much as possible into one unit. So great, thanks everybody. That was just kind of a warm up to get us started here. To give you an idea of the rest of today's, or the next 2 hours of this lesson, we're going to be working through the lesson plan that's linked in the calendar, and I will work through part of it, have my screen shared, and we can talk about some questions, and then there'll be an opportunity that I'll open it up for people to work on their own and implement this on a different example. And then we'll come back together and talk about some ways to refactor and apply abstraction and encapsulation to this concept. And then we'll have some time to work individually on that as well. So everybody can see my screen, right? Great, thanks. We're going to start by just working through part of this lesson plan, and we're going to consume an API. We'll be doing it using Faraday. And then, like I said, yeah, we'll break and work on that individually and then come back and do some refactors. So this is a deeper dive sort of what we were talking about last week in both the APIs class and the abstraction and encapsulation class. So let me just get myself organized here. All right. Yep, we are going to be working with the Ghibli API, which I know we have a few fans, so that's exciting. The first thing we're going to need to do is, you'll see in the lesson plan, it says create a directory for your code. I've already done that. I've created this intro to APIs Ghibli folder, and I'm going to make a lib directory in this folder. And we're also going to need to create a gem file because we're going to be using some gems, and Rails includes the gem file for us by default, right? But we can still create our own gem file and install that way. So I'm going to go ahead and make a gem file. And in here we have this blob of code. I'll go ahead and switch over to point to what I'm looking at. We're going to copy all this and just drop it in our gem file. So the first line here is telling our gem file where to get this stuff. Basically, pretty much any gem you're going to be using will be documented or I guess cataloged at rubygems.org. And then this, I'm actually not entirely sure why we need this, but I'm guessing this has something to do with the way that our gem file is going to work. And I'm just going to copy and paste it because I'm not entirely sure what it does, but it's in the lesson plan. So I'm assuming we need it. Sure, Katie.
Yeah, I just had a quick question about the Faraday, and I don't recall if we talked about this last week, so please forgive me. But with Faraday, is that the only way that is that the only gem we can use to reach out to APIs, or are there other gems that we can use to also reach out to APIs?
That's a great question. And there are several. Actually, there's even an example here in the API documentation, which we'll come back to. Let me see if I can figure out how to showcase this. So there is one built into Ruby called NetHTTP. But my understanding is that Faraday is much more popular, and you can pretty much count on, as far as I know, using Faraday throughout Turing to work with APIs in Ruby. Is that helpful? Cool. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and copy this and put this in our gem file. And then we are using the Faraday gem and then pry just to interact with our code, etc. So there's that. And then I think the next thing will be, let's see, what was I going to do next? Yeah, I'm going to go ahead and bundle. And this should generate our gemfile.lock, so we know that it worked. And the next thing I'm going to do is create a file inside of our lib directory. It's pretty much going to act as a runner file today. We're going to be working with this API just in Ruby. And then at the very end of the class, if we have a little bit of time, I might show how this could be organized in a Rails project, but it's very similar. And just for simplicity, we're going to be working in Ruby. So I'm going to put a file in here called Ghibli Films, I think. And inside of this file, we're going to go ahead and require those gems. And we're going to require JSON as well. And I believe that's it for now. So let's see, where do we go from here? The other day, we talked about using curl as a starting point to explore APIs, make sure we're getting a response and just kind of see what it's going to look like. And today, we might just do a little bit of that. But for the most part, we're going to be working with Faraday. So actually, let's see. Our goal with this exercise is to list all the names, or all the Ghibli film titles, we'll say. So before we go and implement this in Faraday, I thought we could go through the exercise of looking at the documentation. It's a really good skill to have. Basically, anytime you're implementing a new API, your first stop is going to be the documentation, and preferably reading through as much of it as you can, or as much of it as applies to you. For today, I just want to point out a couple of things here, and we'll take a look at a couple of curl examples. Let's see what's interesting here to note. This API was created to help users discover resources, consume them via HTTP requests, and interact with them in whatever way makes sense. Just highlighting here that APIs are going to communicate via HTTP, which makes it a lot easier to integrate that functionality or bringing that data to our application, because we don't have to worry about what language the other application is speaking. We can connect over HTTP. Here is a curl example, like we were mentioning. This one is going to grab a film with a specific ID. So curl is just going to be like we mentioned the other day. It's only used in the terminal, but to get an idea of what this API provides to us, we can come to the terminal, make some space, and then just enter this curl and then the URL, the endpoint. And we get back something like that. Cool. But we won't spend too much time there. Really today, what we want to focus on is using this in Ruby and using Faraday. So the first thing I'm going to add in here is, one second, sorry. Just the Faraday syntax that we'll use a lot. And we'll say this is, we'll just say data for now, and we'll say Faraday.get, and then we're going to put our endpoint in here. So at this point, we're going to be looking in the documentation for the endpoint that matches or most closely matches the data we're looking to find. And we are looking to pretty much grab all the Ghibli films, and we're going to do some stuff to print out their titles. So here I'm looking over on the side, and it has a section for endpoints. I'm pretty sure what I'm going to want is films. and there's this endpoint, get return all films. Okay. And I think I'm actually going to, after reading that, I'm going to go ahead and scroll down in the lesson plan. It's also mentioned here. So this is just a URL, but we're going to be referring to these as endpoints because these are URLs that are specifically designed for API consumption. We're going to take that endpoint and we're going to paste it in as an argument to our Faraday call, and that should get us what we need. Before I run this, I'm going to put in a pry so we can stop and look at what we're getting back. And let's see. We'll say, I'm trying to think about how to organize this so it makes the most sense, but I think we'll say film endpoint. Then we'll set our response to a variable with response equals response.body, or sorry, I'm looking at the wrong line in my notes. That we're just going to set this to response, and we'll set up another variable for the response body, and we'll call that film data. So when I run this, I would expect Faraday to go get some data from this API endpoint. We're assigning it to a response variable. And yeah, let's just walk through it actually. So I think this will be lib Ghibli films. So like I'd mentioned, and I do think I'll make this a little bit bigger. If I put response in here, we'll get everything that Faraday grabbed from that endpoint. This is going to include a lot of things that we probably don't need right now. We have a bunch of headers and metadata, but then we're really interested in the response body, and that's what we're setting to a variable on line 7. Response.body and film data are the same thing in our program at this point. So this is our unparsed string. And the next step is going to be to parse this using JSON so that it's just a little bit more workable. So we'll say JSON parse film data. And that looks like it's a lot easier to work with. So I'm going to go ahead and put that in our file as well. We'll call this JSON. And one neat thing that you can add in here to make this even more workable or readable is, I believe it's symbolized names. And that way, when we're working to manipulate this response, this JSON collection that we've gotten back, we don't have to use the string notation to access the hash values. We can use the symbol syntax, and I'll just show what I'm talking about real quick. Running that one more time. And now when I type in JSON, I get this back. And as you can see, like if I did, one thing I want to point out here is that we have an array of hashes. So if I do this and I grab the first value in that array, then I can use the symbol syntax to get back, let's say, director. Is this making sense to everybody so far? Any questions coming up? To some extent, it's pretty much a review of what we talked about the other day, but pretty foundational to what we're going to be working on. So wanted to cover that. And then I think I was going to do this when we came back from our breakout rooms, but I think we're probably, if everybody feels good about this so far, we can probably just go ahead and iterate over this response that we're getting back and print out the names. Yeah, actually, let's look at the lesson plan. So we are about to here. Yeah, I think actually I would like people to work on this on your own. And if questions come up, then we can talk about them as a group. That might be more valuable. So what I would like everybody to do is, oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have switched screens so fast. But I would like everybody to skip through the rest of this material and go down to the practice section of the lesson plan. And I'm going to ask you all to, we'll stay in the main Zoom room. You can feel free to turn off your camera and just work independently. Write some code similar to what we've written up to this point to print out all the names of people from Studio Ghibli films. So what I would imagine that looking like for y'all is to basically write the code that we've written in your text editor and also explore the API documentation a little bit to find the endpoint that's more relevant to you. And then try to at least get to the point where you're returning that data and parsing it with JSON. And if you have some more time, then feel free to start iterating over that data that you have gotten back from your API call and list out the names of the people in these films. So yeah, we'll take about 15 minutes to do that. Does anybody have questions about what I'm asking you to do? Okay, great. Then we'll come back. It's 1:23. Yeah, let's come back at 1:40. And we'll take a look at a couple of examples of what people have done, and then we'll continue on from there. And I'll be here if anybody has questions, and I'll leave this screen up in case you need any references.
Hey, Jameson. I am wondering, so we're trying to get the people data back, correct?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so are we trying to translate? It looks like, what is this, Elixir? Or are we just making the loop like that grabs the directors and titles?
Yeah, so I'm not sure what you're looking at that you're wondering if you should translate. We should be able
In the
to.
documentation.
Yeah, so let's actually look through that together in case other people are running into the same thing. Just as a exercise. So if you're coming down here to people, you should be able to get, and I should move my Zoom stuff so I can see. So this would be an example of an endpoint. This is probably where I would start.
Yeah, I never clicked on the people tab. That makes
Gotcha.
more sense.
Yeah, no
Cool.
worries. And it's like so much of this process is really, exploring the documentation. And I actually forgot when I first opened this up. My Zoom was covering it, but your endpoint should be over here. And then by grabbing just this part, you should be able to get like something really similar to what we saw in the other example with films.
Cool. Thank you.
No problem. And then I saw another question in chat. If you've already gotten, Andrew says, are we just trying to get the people information? Yeah, if you've gotten this call to work and you're getting data back, then the next step would be to try to do something so that, write some code so that when you run this file, it prints all the names of the people in your terminal.
Jameson, may I ask you a question that's
Yep, of course.
related to APIs, but a little unrelated to all this
Okay.
that we're doing at the moment? I was like trying to do some of the API stuff for the project, and I kept running into what was it, like API rate limit exceeded.
Mm-hmm.
And I was looking into that, and it was because I was like unauthenticated
Mm-hmm.
that I only got like 60 whatevers. Didn't quite understand what exactly that was, but like if I was authenticated, I could get up to like 500. But basically for like an hour, I just can't, my page won't load. My app won't load in the web browser, and I can't really do anything with like APIs if I hit that rate limit.
Gotcha. Yeah, just to make sure I'm understanding your question, that is something that is happening, and you have not, you're using the API that has the 60, right? You have not gone through any authentication?
No, yeah, I haven't
Okay.
gone through any authentication. I didn't understand how to do that. But I thought maybe like I was doing it, I was like setting up like all my APIs wrong, and that's why it was like taking a couple seconds to load my web page, and like also it was just like funneling through that. And I know we're gonna get into the lesson. I think in this lesson we're gonna get into how to like avoid going through all that data so often by like creating objects and stuff. But will we be going over like authentication?
Authentication isn't something we'll be going over today. I don't think we have a whole lesson plan built in for that. GitHub does have pretty helpful docs when it comes to authenticating. Let's see. I don't want to necessarily take away from today's lesson time getting into that exactly, but I would say, I can try to remember to drop some links to the GitHub authentication documentation in your cohort channel, and we can open up, a Slack discussion there for people to troubleshoot together. I think that's a good route to go, because if you're rate limited to 60 within, what is it, an hour, I think it would be pretty easy to hit that. So it would be ideal to authenticate. And I don't remember exactly how GitHub has that set up, but it should be a pretty friendly authentication process. Their API is pretty well documented. So if I don't post about it after this class in the cohort channel, please like post a question and tag me, and I can pull Brian in on that conversation too, and see if Brian and Alex have any other helpful resources or things they're looking for in the project as far as authentication.
Awesome, super appreciated. Thank you.
Yeah, of course. We are at time. I'll take your question, Kyle, in just a second, but if you haven't built in a POM, this would be a great time to do that. We'll come back at, we'll take a little bit of a longer POM. Let's come back at 1:47. And then Kyle, yes.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that we did have to authenticate for the project in order to access the more detailed personal data around like pull request numbers, those sorts of things.
Yeah, I'm pretty confident you're going to have to authenticate to get some of that stuff. That's a good point. A lot of it, I think, has to do with particular GitHub accounts and stuff like that. So yeah, I'll double check the project spec and see if there's anything linked there, but then I'll post anything else that might be helpful in the cohort channel, because authenticating is gonna save a lot of pain up early on and probably be necessary later in some of those stories.
Cool, thank you.
All right, see y'all at 1:47. I'm gonna take a POM as well.
Jameson, I have another question.
Sure.
Is it going to require that we put an environment variable in our app in order to authenticate?
Possibly. Sorry,
Okay.
I don't have an answer right off the top of my head for the GitHub API specifically, but that is something that should be detailed in the GitHub docs under like an authentication section if it needs it.
Okay, cool. I was poking around at those docs quite a bit trying to figure out authentication, and I was struggling.
Okay.
So that's why I asked, but thank you.
Sure. Yeah, good to know. Thanks for asking and bringing that up. Yeah, I honestly I do need to refamiliarize myself with the GitHub API and how auth works. But I'll do that after this class. Ben, yes.
Yeah, kind of along those notes of how would you like store somehow, like, because obviously you don't want to like push your token up in your repo, because then that's bad. So are there like files that we then should add to the project that we should like add in a git ignore or something like that? Is there a good way of navigating that?
Yeah, that's a good question. And to Kyle's point, I think a really common one that you'll come across is the .env or the .env file. And yeah, I don't want to go into too much detail on this today.
That was helpful.
Yeah, so a .env, like I won't go through it and show an example, but a .env file would be a really common solution where you would put things like your API key or your client ID, et cetera. And that would be hidden from Git, and it would be unique to every individual, like every person is going to have their own env file for environment variables. Cool, so we are back. I think pretty much everybody is here again. Actually, I don't know why I'm screen sharing, because I wanted to ask for a volunteer. Could somebody take over the share and show us what you came up with? Joseph? Also, you're muted.
Sorry, I couldn't find that for a second.
No, that's okay.
All right, cool. Yeah, I pretty much just switched this to people and then wrote a loop, and then I was able to just like print out the information that I needed to from there. I don't know if that was actually like the intended goal.
Yep.
But
yep, I think this is great. So you got a little bit further than we did in our example that we all looked at together. And to challenge that a little bit, you said you just replaced the part that said / what was it, films with / people?
Yes.
Yeah. So how would we know how to do that? Was that a guess on your part, or?
It was not a guess.
Okay.
The reason I went about it that way is just because I noticed that the code that they're using in here, I just noticed that the code that they were using in here is essentially doing a very similar thing to what we were doing. So I figured that using this like require net HTTP and this URI was doing something similar to what our Faraday is doing, and the response.body, which I assume the body is coming from the Faraday gem.
Gotcha. Yeah, thanks for pulling up that other window and going through that process. Yeah, totally. Like we kind of talked about very briefly at the beginning of the lesson, there are other ways to consume, or there are other ways to, consume APIs than using the Faraday gem. That example in the documentation is using something we get for free in Ruby, but we're using Faraday. My understanding is it's just more popular and has more features. So Joseph, you were able to go to that page in the API documentation and find the URL that they were passing in there to the whatever the built-in one is called, I already forget. But basically say, hey, this is the endpoint. This is what we want our client to interact with. And in our case, in this file that you have open, Faraday is our HTTP client. So awesome. That looks great to me. And then, just iterating over this to print out the names. I think that meets the goal that we were looking for. Thank you for sharing. Cool. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen again, but does anybody have questions? Like what questions came up so far before we move on? Did everybody get to about the same spot where you were able to iterate over and print out a name of a person, of the people? Okay. Cool. Then, okay, go ahead, Andrew.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did you ask if we got get it to put all the people's names?
Yeah, I should have asked for a hand raise, but I was just looking at people to see if they were nodding but thank you. Good. It seems like we're all.
Oh, sorry.
You're totally fine. So I think we're all pretty much in the same spot, which is good. We can go ahead and continue. So I'm gonna write something similar to what Joseph was showing. And for our example, we'll say something like, so this is, I'm gonna run this again. Yeah, so if I type in JSON here, we get something similar back. And like we had talked about before, this is an array of hashes. So we're gonna iterate over that array and we'll say something like films JSON each. I really can't type today, apologies. Film. And we're going to print out the name of the film, which I think was called title, right? And let's just put that, and we'll actually get rid of our pry here. Now when I run this, I get just an output of all the titles of these films that I grabbed. So that's basically where we wanted to get before we started refactoring and starting to think about, okay, well, what does this look like in the context of a real life project? I would say that this is not very well abstracted or encapsulated. We aren't doing a whole lot. Like there isn't a lot of functionality in this file right now, but there is functionality that isn't related to each other. There is data being handled without being encapsulated in its own singular unit. So we're going to start abstracting some of that away by creating a model-like object, not a model because we're not using application record. We're not inheriting from that. We're not persisting anything to the database, but we're going to create a model-like object that will be responsible for encapsulating the data that has to do with a film. So in order to do this, I think what I'm going to do is dream drive a little bit. And there are probably questions coming up about testing. We can definitely talk about that in a little bit, but for the purpose of exploring this and for the exercise, we're going to dream drive this and just type out the code that we wish we had. So it would be great if I could have something called film and just put the data that I got back from the API into this model-like object, like so. And then I'm going to have to iterate over that to print out the names, but this is actually going to have to be a map. We want to return a new collection with these objects that we're creating here. And then we want to be able to iterate over our films. Actually, no, that one will be an each. And this is where we will ideally have a title for our film, and we can just put it here. So now if I try to run this, I'm going to run into an error, and we can kind of follow it along similar to how we would in TDD, but now we're doing dream-driven development. So this is uninitialized constant film, and I need to go create a file and a class so that we have something that'll match up to that. So I'll do film.rb. This will just be class film. And now when I run this, we should get a different error. Oh, I need to actually require this. So because we don't have to require these in Rails, that auto imports everything, but we're going to need to require it here. So I'll do require. I think it'll be like that. Let's try it. Great. So now we've moved on to a different error. It says wrong number of arguments given 1 expected 0. When I was dream driving this, I wanted to take whatever film we were iterating over from our Json, from our API response, and populate this new object with that. So I'm going to need to set up, let me move around some things on my screen. Sorry. So I'm going to move this over and open these up side by side. Now I'm going to give this an initialize. And we'll call the argument here, I think, film data. And right now, all that we need is the title of the film. So I'm just going to set that up like so. Title, film, data, title, very similar to how we were grabbing it and printing it out to the screen before we started this refactor. So I'm still expecting to get an error. This will act as a little bit of a Ruby review. Anybody have an idea what I am missing? You can just shout it out if you'd like.
Data reader.
Yeah, exactly.
Readers. Woo.
Yep. So to be super clear, this could be a method of its own. We could say title and then just return the instance variable. But our shorthand for that is our adder reader. That should make the instance variable title available to us. And at this point, I'm hoping to get the same result that we got before, where it prints out all the titles of the films. So there we have an example of abstraction, where we had this functionality that was having to do with the data in a film, but we had nothing to represent a film in our program. So we abstracted that, and we are now encapsulating the title in this film class. So yeah, that's as much as I'll say about that. And then we will move on to abstracting away some of the logic about that has to do with actually consuming the API. So some of y'all might remember in our last API class, we spent a little bit of time talking about, well, where does this stuff live in the context of an MVC framework, right? Like it's not really a model. We're not storing this data to the database. That's the whole reason we're using an API, is that that's taken care of for us. It lives somewhere else. We're just using this data on our app. You could do this in a controller. You could use a Faraday call in a controller, but that isn't really a scalable solution. It's not really the responsibility of a controller to handle API stuff. And this is all, like I would say, pretty obviously by now, something we don't want to do in a view, right? And we talked a little bit about service objects. And service objects are where I would expect API logic to live. So I'm just going to walk through a refactor that will go into how that would work. So very similar to how we extracted this out and we made a film class. I'm going to make a new file called, I think I'll call it Ghibli service. And I'm going to move this over to the same panel as the film class. And to dream drive this a little bit as well, I think it would be awesome if instead of having to do these lines 7 through 9, if I could just say, so for line 13, we're going to need a variable called JSON. What if our JSON variable was, and to be more clear, I'll comment this out before I start dream driving. It would be great if this could just be JSON equals Ghibli service dot new. So I'll make an instance of the service and then call a method on that service like films. So, or to be more specific, let's say film names or film titles. So this doesn't exist yet. If I try to run this, I'll get an error. It says uninitialized constant Ghibli service. And we did create that class, but like film, we have to import it. Let's see if we get the same error now. So now it's saying undefined method film titles for Ghibli service because we haven't defined that method yet. So I'll go over here and do that. We could say film titles. And this is where we would want everything that we commented out up here to live. Now this doesn't have to live in our runner file. You can take that out. And we can put it here. And we can uncomment it. Because, well, if I don't uncomment it, we just have that empty we have that empty method, then the error that we get is undefined method map for nil class on line 10, which makes sense, right? Because our JSON variable is creating a new instance of Ghibli service. It's going to film titles. Film titles is returning nil. And at that point, JSON is nil on line 10. So now we're going to uncomment these 3 lines and run our file again. Now we get the same result. So our functionality hasn't changed. We're printing out exactly like we said at the very beginning of this exercise. We are listing all of the Ghibli film titles, but instead of having everything just dumped into one file, we've been able to abstract some of that away so that on our high-level interface, we don't really know exactly how we're consuming the API. We don't know how we're parsing the JSON, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one way that we've put abstraction into practice. And we've encapsulated the responsibility of going over to the Ghibli API and getting our stuff and bringing it back to us. That is now encapsulated inside of the Ghibli service class. Now, I think we can take this a step further though, and make the Ghibli service a little bit more flexible, and we can abstract even further within this class. And the way we could do that is by breaking this up into a couple of methods. So let's say that the work that I've done here with film titles, we now want to combine it with somebody else that y'all have been working on getting people from the movies, right? The point is we are going to be hitting the same API, but we might have different endpoints that we're going to be hitting. So one way that we might be able to refactor this out a little bit is, and I'm really going to try to dream drive this, so give me a second here to think in my head. So we could say we're getting the films. So we could set up a variable called film and films endpoint, because this is multiple. And then just copy this. This string is our endpoint for films specifically. And then we can say maybe something like get data and pass that our endpoint. That's the dream scenario here. And I'm going to go implement this get data method now because, oops, I'm not even sure what error I'll get here, but I'm pretty sure it's not going to work. It says undefined method get data. And then here, this could take any endpoint. So for instance, maybe another method that we could have here is get people, and then I would be passing in a people endpoint. But the get data method doesn't need to know what kind of endpoint it is. It just needs to accept an argument. So I'm just going to call that endpoint. At that point, I can take some of this functionality that I was just wrapping up into film titles into this method and take that away and put it into the get data method. And I think there'll be a couple things we'll need to change here. Let's see. Yeah, so now instead of going to an explicit hard-coded string here, we'll give it the endpoint variable that we got on line 8. I think the rest should be just about the same, but we don't need to call this film data anymore. This could be any kind of data. So now hopefully we can kind of start to see the advantage of abstraction on a smaller scale, right? Now we have that very, I would describe it as brittle implementation that was in film titles. We have it abstracted out so that now we can rely on get data for whatever kind of endpoint, whichever endpoint that we want to be accessing, we can use the get data method to do that. So at this point, I would expect all this to still work because on line 8, we're calling film titles. Film titles is setting its endpoint that we want to use and then calling the get data helper method that we set up here. So let's see if we can get this to work. And we get the same thing back. What questions are coming up for y'all? Alexa?
So I'm trying to think about this in a Rails application and to abstract it away, my understanding is it would be a model, but would it inherit application record since it has no tie to the database? I feel like it shouldn't.
It's a good question. Can you, specifically, which class were you talking about and asking whether it should inherit from application record? Ghibli service or film, the service?
Yeah, the whole class. So Ghibli service, would it inherit from application record?
So I would say there may be real world scenarios where more of these things will live in the database than not, but generally we want to avoid storing things that are happening with an API or storing things that we get from an API in the database, because the purpose of an API is to let us bypass a database, right? So we don't need to inherit in our service objects or in our poros from API. And when I say poro, that's P-O-R-O, plain old Ruby object. And the implication is that it's not saved in the database and it doesn't inherit from application record. And I have some time set aside at the end of the lesson today to just look at the file structure of what this could look like in a Rails app. And hopefully that'll make it a little bit more clear. But for now, the answer, I'll just say no. We don't want either of these to inherit from application record. Any
Awesome, thank you.
Sure. Any other questions or follow-up to that? For anyone? Genevieve?
Yeah, so I guess I'm just curious that, like, if we're saving this to an object, for example, for each film is becoming its own object, what happens when that data gets updated through the API? Are we having to continually make calls out, or how do we ensure that we have the most up-to-date info, I suppose?
That's a good question. And I'd say a lot of the answer is probably situational, unfortunately. But with our example today, I would say right now, we don't have anything that would need to be updated because of the way that this is working. So whenever we run this file, and I know this is a very small and contrived example, and your question, Genevieve, may be more towards like a Rails app, but for the sake of this example, just to walk through it, whenever we run this, it's actually going to create a new service object. And then the service object is actually going to go hit the API and get the most up-to-date data and print that out for us. So the nice thing about APIs is, depending upon how you have them set up, they're pretty flexible and you don't have to do a lot of updating. You can trust the people who are maintaining the API to update the data for you. And often you'll be making API calls in a way that you can trust whatever is being given back to you. I think that's that kind of highlights why we tend to not want to save things that we get from APIs to our database, because we really aren't responsible for maintaining that data. A lot of the time, it's the purpose of an API is to display the data to the user, or something related to the user experience, so we can just let our poros handle it and pass it on to our views and just have the integration work that way. Is that a good answer to your question, Genevieve, or do you have any follow-up? Because it does depend.
I think I understand, but I just want to make sure, like, obviously you said later we'll apply this to maybe a Rails application, but for example, if this API call lived within a view, each time that view is refreshed, we're making the call out to get that info. So that's how it essentially keeps itself up to date?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes,
okay,
and we can get in, there are more details to get into, but for today's scope, I'd say that's a really good way to understand it. And just a very quick anecdote before we move on. I worked on an API integration at one of my jobs where we had a concept of a model that was very similar to the data we were getting back from the API, but it was more for us to be able to keep track of where a user was in a process of something. So we would sometimes compare what we had in our DB to what we would get when we hit the API endpoint. So there are cases like that. I would say it's a really good case for not storing the responses you're getting from the API anywhere, and just letting your program hit the API whenever you need that new information. So if you needed it in a view, you could have something in your controller kicking off all these processes just to make sure you're pulling the most recent data from the API. Then your controller packages up whatever your service object provides and passes it down into the view. And again, I think it would be more clear to come back to this example after we have a little, like at the end of the lesson when we have more practice, and then we'll come back and look at this in the context of Rails. Kyle?
Yeah, I was just curious, I guess, if you use any sort of like memoization so that it's like you sort of like temporarily store it so that you don't have to keep sort of pinging it. And that would be something you could store in like application controller or in other controllers so that, yeah, the views aren't pinging as often.
Yeah, I won't speak in detail about, I won't speak to where to store that memoization, but caching and memoization are options and layers that you could implement on top of an API service for sure. And yeah, like I mentioned a little bit ago, hopefully we're never calling an API directly from the view. That's kind of the purpose of abstraction and encapsulation, and also just of MVC in general. The pattern that I would expect in most scenarios is that we get some kind of request to our controller. We figure out in our controller or wherever, oh, we need to get some API data. And then the controller can grab something from a service, just like we set up here in plain Ruby. And then the service can go talk to the API, get us whatever data we need, and then pass it back to the controller, which can pass it on to the view. So I would say that logic lives further back than the view, but memoization and caching and those kinds of tools can be used to make the API experience more efficient, so you're not pinging your API constantly, and also just, yeah, easier to work with. Cool. Any other questions? Ben?
I was just wondering if putting stuff for like for instance, in our project, the GitHub API stuff, I'm wondering if it's along the same lines of not wanting to put those calls in the view if you don't want to put them in like the application.html. So yeah, similar to where we put like, you know, the global headers, quote unquote, of like having, you know, a header appear across all pages because it's in that application.html or whatever it is. I was wondering if it's also a bad idea to put API stuff in there so it can persist across all the pages. Is that also something that we want to avoid?
So to make sure I'm understanding correctly, you're talking about going to application.html.erb and using ERB tags to call an API, basically. I would avoid that. I think how do I say this? Yeah. I would prioritize abstracting that API logic into a service object over trying to dry up your views. So that's just what I'll say about that. Yeah, this isn't like model data logic because it's not our database. We're not storing it anywhere, but we can apply the same MVC kind of principles to it. We want to be working out of poros and model-like classes instead of just calling this stuff straight from the view.
Right, and so then once we abstract that, encapsulate it, and we're able to reference like, you know, an instance variable from return of one thing, is that then okay to have in views and stuff of like one instance variable?
Yeah, I would say as far as MVC and how to package up that stuff and send it to your views, I would suggest following the same best practices of MVC and how you would treat that as a model. Like, yeah, so in a lot of ways you can treat this stuff as if it was a model. That's why we say that like film, for instance, is a model-like object. It should behave very similarly when it comes to your controllers and your views, but we're not persisting it.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Sure. I feel like I saw another hand up at some point. Any other questions or thoughts? Kyle, did you have another question or was that from before? Okay, cool. All right, then I think in that case, I'd like everybody to take about, we'll say 20 minutes and work on your people endpoint exercise that you are working on and try to do something similar where you can abstract some of this logic away and encapsulate data functionality like in a way that makes sense. So, and then also so that would be for a class similar to what we have here with film, and then also take that actual API call functionality and abstract that into a service. And we'll work independently in this Zoom room. You can turn off your camera or leave and come back, and we'll come back. Let's see, it's 2:17. I do want to give us time. We'll come back at 2:47, or well, yeah, we'll say 2:47. I want to give everybody enough time to really mess around with this and give it a try. And if you have any questions, just feel free to come off mute and we'll work through it. Any questions about what I'm asking y'all to do before I stop? And just to be super clear, once you finish all of this, you should still be able to run your file and get the same output. The listing of people's names, I'm guessing, is what most people had before we came back together. So the idea here is to refactor that into a model-like object, to use a model-like object, and to also use a service object and get the same output in your terminal. Cool. We'll come back in 20 minutes. So I guess that would be, sorry, I think I said 40 last time. We'll say 2:37. All right, could I get a hand raise reaction if you were able to get through those refactors that we talked about? Cool. Okay, I think I'll give it 3 more minutes to allow people some time to continue, and then we'll come back and talk questions and examples at 2:40. And if you need to take a quick palm right now, that's fine too. We'll come back at 2:40. Okay, let's come back together. If you are coming back from a palm or your work, if you could turn on your camera, that would be great. Thank you. Cool. Well, let's just start with what questions came up during that exercise. Cool. Then I'm guessing pretty much everybody got through those refactors or was close, and it was more of a matter of time for getting through the rest of it, which is totally fine. And I'd recommend, working through the lesson plan and abstracting out a service object and a Poro for a model-like object. If you didn't get through that, then I'd recommend taking some time to work on it on your own. And then there are also a couple of extensions that you can feel free to experiment with. But for now, I think what I'd like to do is share my screen again and go over what some of this might look like in the context of a Rails app. So can everybody see my screen? Cool. Okay, cool. So I'm going to open up this Rails project that I had set up before. And basically just point out a couple of things. So there were some good questions about how this would work in a Rails app. And I'm sure thinking about taking this from the Ruby that we practiced and putting it into Ruby on Rails is sounds like a little bit of a big ask. So I just thought I'd go through first the file structure. Here we have what you would normally see. We have app, but I added 2 directories here, one for Poros and one for services. So in the services directory, we just have Ghibli service, and this works in a really similar way to the Ghibli service that we saw in our plain Ruby exercise, right? We have our films method, and we have that calling another helper method that's more flexible that could get data from any endpoint. And then in the Poros directory, we have a film object, which is behaving, again, very similar to how we saw in plain Ruby. We're using our initialize method to get the title from the film data that we're passing in. And we talked a little bit about how all this fits into MVC and eventually gets this data back to your view, right? And the way that I would suggest doing that is to think about it exactly like you would a model. We're no longer storing this in the database, but our controller doesn't need to behave any differently because of that. Our views don't need to behave any differently because of that. We can still set up this instance variable in our controller to use in a view, and we can create these model-like objects to store in the instance variable without persisting them to the database. So there's that. I think I will start my server. Just to demonstrate here. Hold on, I'm gonna need a new window. And if I go to localhost and go /films, I think I had it set up to do, we get this, I guess I should have also shown the view, but I'll put that down here and go to the view. So we have that instance variable in our controller being passed to our view. We're iterating over each of those and displaying the title. We're able to use dot notation here because it's a Ruby object. It's no longer the hash syntax because we have abstracted away that JSON parsing and API consumption and all that is tossed over to our service class. So we can pretty much treat this like we would treat anything that did live in our database. And we can see that here at localhost 3000 films. We have the same exact output that we were experimenting with in the terminal with our plain Ruby. More questions or thoughts about this pattern as it pertains to Rails? Ben?
Yeah, so Rails will recognize the keywords for poros and services as directories, or is that just kind of where you have to explicitly tell that to Rails?
I'm not quite sure. When you say recognize it as directories,
the poros folder and the services folder in like the root of the app.
Yeah. Okay. I think I get what you're asking. Yeah. So any directory that we add, and I just realized this is probably something that we haven't done yet in mod 2, but you can add things to app. And really, I believe anything at the root level that you add here will be auto-loaded for you. So when we add services and poros to the app, Rails knows to load these classes that we're defining. Basically going to say we don't have to require other files or anything like that the way that we did in Ruby, because Rails is magical and it'll just say, oh, you're defining a new class in your services directory. I better make that available to you throughout your controllers. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, and so they're not like specific Rails keywords. They're just kind of things that we add on to use in our app.
Yeah, exactly. And to kind of drive that home, we didn't need to have Rails running, like we were able to use things like class Ghibli service, and we were able to create a new Ghibli service object without being in Rails. We don't have any special syntax for service objects. They're just Ruby objects. And really you could say that this Ghibli service is a poro, but the reason that we divide them into different directories is for us as developers. We know that the service directory is going to have a bunch of classes, presumably, or whatever, that have to do with going and doing something for us. Whereas just poros, these are going to represent something that's like a model, but is not saved to our database.
Cool, that makes a lot more sense. Thanks.
Sure. Other questions or things that we can clarify? I think another thing that might be worth talking about is testing. So this is what I would expect a test for this level of implementation to look like. And this is really bright. I'm just going to get rid of it. This is what I would expect a service model test, or sorry, not model, but like a service object. I would expect this to be how it's tested. You can create a services directory inside spec the same way you would features or models. And then you can set up an RSpec test very similar to how you would elsewhere. And the thing to keep in mind with testing API implementations is that whenever you hit your API endpoint, that's going to count, so to speak. We talked a little bit already about rate limiting for the GitHub API in the context of authentication. But in general, you don't want to be hitting your API 5,000 times every time you run your test suite, right? So later on, probably, I think this is all going to be mod 3 stuff to worry about. There are some tools that you can use to mock API calls, and specifically to run the API call once and then save the response and then use that response for your testing. There's a tool called VCR. I think the other one that we teach here at Turing is called WebMock. And just for the record, this isn't necessary for your project. We aren't necessarily looking for these tests to test for your service objects in the project you're working on right now. It would be great to see, though, if you wanted to give it a try. And for the scope of this project, it's probably okay to write a few simple tests and just hit the API every time. But just know that there's more content coming about how you can make those tests more efficient, and just best practices around that as far as like mocking and stubbing and using tools like VCR to keep your API calls on the lower side. But yeah, this would be an example of something that you could do without implementing any of that. We could do the same thing that we've already covered by creating a new Ghibli service instance, getting the films, and then just expecting that it's the right data type, that something's there, and that it has the keys that you expect from that API call. So I wanted to mention that because, yeah, just for the sake of clarity, that you can test this stuff, you can test drive this stuff, but because of kind of some of the complications that arise with rate limiting and stuff like that, we're not including this as a requirement on the project. Okay, let's see. And then I think I was noticing something while we had our work time about this Ghibli service. This is super similar to what we talked about in our regular Ruby files, but since we're here, can anybody think of a way that we might be able to abstract the logic in this Ghibli service further? And take your time looking over this code, and if you have an idea, go ahead and raise your hand. So I think there's one more thing we could do here to make this a little bit more, to encapsulate things more appropriately. Adam, any ideas?
If you had several things that you're doing, several APIs, you could maybe, looks like on line 10, the JSON parse, maybe you could just like pull that out because it's kind of doing a different thing. It's like you got all the information from the API, now you're just making it into a format that's something you can more easily manipulate and turn into Poros.
Yeah, that's a great idea. So you were saying specifically we could maybe extract this and put this one line 10 somewhere else? Is that what?
Yeah, maybe something like that.
Cool. Yeah. I like that idea. And I actually think I want to take it a step further. Like to your point, what if we were working with the Ghibli API and the GitHub API, or maybe like Google Maps or something like that? Actually, everything from line 7 to line 10 is in all likelihood going to behave the same way, no matter what API we're working on. Does that make sense that people pretty much agree? Because we can give it an endpoint, we can get the response, we can say, hey, we really only care about the response body, and then we can parse that data and symbolize the names so it's easier to work with, right? So what if we had something more generic like API service? And I'll just move that over here. And here we actually want to be looking at the Ghibli service. So what if we just took this whole get data method and put it into our API service? What would we need to do in order to share that functionality with Ghibli service in this case? Any ideas? What could we use that we've talked about? And Ben, go ahead.
I also then had a question. Since this is kind of like gig extracted code, would this then qualify of like a good use for a module, and then we just include all of the like we include this API service and all of, like, let's say we had a Ghibli service versus, like, you know, a Quentin Tarantino service or stuff like that. Would this then be better as a module, or do we want to still have this as kind of like a stateless class?
Gotcha. Yeah, that could be one option. You could put this into a module instead of making this a class, and you could then include or extend depending. And that's a good point. Maybe that would be more in line with the responsibilities of a module, since we're mostly looking at behavior over state. So that's an option, and I think it would be a good option. You can make an argument for that. As we have it set up right here, though, there's, I think, something else that we could do that is something we've already practiced. Jesus?
Hey, what about inheritance?
Yeah, that's kind of where my mind went with this. If we have this API service that's going to be shared across a bunch of different ones, then we could inherit. And that way the Ghibli service would have access to the get data method. Yeah, and I don't think it would be, I think it would be fine to also use a module, but since we haven't covered that in great detail, I think I won't actually code that out today, but thank you both. Good ideas. Cool. We are at about 2:55, and next y'all have work time. I think there are some, I know there's some unanswered questions about authentication and how to get that working for the sake of the project. So keep an eye out on Slack for that. But I think for the lesson today, I'm going to go ahead and call it here and give you all a few minutes to take a palm before your work time. And also please remember to fill out the survey for today's class. That's super helpful when y'all give us that feedback. But yeah, any last questions before we wrap it up? That's pretty much all the content I had for y'all today. Awesome, thank you. Well, I hope you all enjoy working with APIs. I think they're really fun, and the sky's the limit as far as like the possibilities of implementing these. And it's kind of cool to see how, you know, all those lessons about HTTP and abstraction, encapsulation, inheritance, et cetera, how it all kind of comes together to give you these tools that you can hopefully go and implement on your project. But yeah, just the survey reminder, and hope you all have a good rest of your afternoon. Thanks, everybody.